He had visible injuries, a lot of bruising on his eyes, bruising on his torso. He was skinny, but being able to see his bones.
He pokes his eye and he pokes his ear.
He has a behavioral, because he gets up at night and he goes into the kitchen and eats.
In the summer of 2021, a San Antonio police officer stood in the kitchen of an apartment on the city's east side, looking at a 4-year-old boy with 2 black eyes and a body so thin his ribs were visible through his shirt. The child's father and stepmother had an explanation ready. The boy hurt himself, they said. He poked his own eyes. He picked at his own skin. The officer wrote his report, made a call to child welfare services, and left. 5 weeks later, the same boy was dead. What happened in between, and what happened afterward in 2 criminal trials, would expose not just the actions of 2 adults, but the failure of a system that had already been given a warning. This is the case of Benjamin Cervera. Benjamin was known to the people who loved him as Benji. He was 4 years old in the summer of 2021, one of several children in a blended household in San Antonio, Texas. His biological parents were Brandon Lee Cervera Sr. and Erica Flores, who had separated, and Benjamin spent time in both of their homes, along with time in the home Brandon shared with his then-wife, Miranda Casares. Casares was not Benjamin's biological mother. She was his stepmother, and by the accounts later given in court, she was the adult primarily responsible for his day-to-day care while Brandon worked. According to testimony presented at trial, Benjamin's condition changed depending on where he was. When he stayed with people outside his father's household, he could gain weight. He was potty trained. He was, in the words used by prosecutors, thriving. When he returned to the home he shared with his father and stepmother, that changed. He regressed to wearing a diaper. He lost weight. Over time, according to the state's case, he became severely malnourished. By the time of his death, Benjamin weighed 28 pounds. For comparison, the average 4-year-old in the United States weighs somewhere between 30 and 40 pounds. Benjamin was well below that, and photographs later shown to jurors depicted a child whose bones were visible beneath his skin. The household itself did not look, on the surface, like a place of deprivation. Officers who visited later testified that the apartment appeared clean, organized, and unremarkable. There was food in the cabinets. There were other children in the home who did not show the same signs of malnutrition. That contrast, a home that looked normal, containing a child who did not look normal, would become one of the central, unresolved tensions of the entire case. To understand how the case unfolded, it helps to go back to July of 2021, about a month before Benjamin died. San Antonio police responded to the home for a welfare check. Body cam footage from that visit, later shown in court, captured the encounter. Officer Omar Perez and other responding officers found Benjamin with 2 black eyes, bruising on his torso, and a frame so thin that his bones were visibly protruding. Witnesses also noted gauze around his ears. When officers asked about the injuries, Brandon Cervera told them Benjamin had behavioral issues, that he poked at his own eyes and ears. Casares offered a similar explanation, describing nighttime episodes where Benjamin would get up, go into the kitchen, and eat. Both parents said they had medical appointments scheduled to have his injuries evaluated. Around this same time, according to reporting on the case, a family member contacted the statewide intake line for the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, reporting that Benjamin had lost a noticeable amount of weight. DFPS opened an investigation. The outcome of that investigation was what is known as a safety plan, an agreement, not legally binding, in which the family and the agency agree to certain steps intended to protect the child. It did not result in Benjamin's removal from the home. The responding police officer, Perez, referred the case to Child Protective Services for further review. He did not take further action himself that day. Years later, testifying at trial, Perez would say he regretted that decision. He told the court he believed he could have done more, that he wished he had spoken to Benjamin alone, without his parents present, rather than relying on the explanations he was given. It is a moment that recurs in the case's aftermath. a system that had contact with an at-risk child, and a professional who, looking back, believed the response fell short. 1 month after that welfare check, Benjamin Cervera was dead. On the morning of August 17, 2021, according to testimony and reporting from the trial, Miranda Casares bought tacos for the household, including Benjamin. After dropping other children off at school, she returned to the apartment and told investigators she fell asleep. When she woke, she said, she found Benjamin unresponsive. A witness would later describe what came from his mouth as mucousy blood. A neighbor, Julie Center, told investigators she saw Casares emerge from the apartment carrying the limp child in her arms. Casares placed him in a car, began a phone call, and flagged down passing vehicles for help outside the family's apartment complex on Eisenhower Road. Benjamin was taken to a hospital in San Antonio, reported in various accounts as Christus Children's Hospital, and per his father's own account, Santa Rosa. Brandon Cervera would later describe getting a call around 10:45 that morning, telling him his son was unresponsive, and driving to the hospital immediately. By roughly 11:32 that morning, doctors had stopped attempting to revive him. Benjamin was pronounced dead. The Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office conducted the autopsy. Their conclusion was direct. Benjamin Cervera died of starvation. The medical examiner's findings also addressed the visible bruising and injuries on his body, the black eyes, the marks that had been explained away as self-inflicted during the July welfare check. According to the police report built from that autopsy, many of those injuries were not self-inflicted at all, and were instead consistent with physical abuse. Investigators were clear on one point. None of those specific injuries were what killed him. His death was attributed to malnutrition, not trauma. But the presence of both, starvation and unexplained bruising, shaped the direction the investigation would take. After Benjamin's death, San Antonio detectives obtained a search warrant for the apartment. What they found reinforced the picture beginning to emerge. There were locks on the refrigerator, locks on the kitchen cabinets, a lock on the pantry door, and a lock on Benjamin's own bedroom door, positioned in a way that could keep him confined inside the room. Investigators also gathered a substantial volume of digital evidence, more than 30 videos, pulled from cell phones belonging to Casares and from surveillance cameras that Brandon Cervera kept inside the home. Detective Lawrence Syans, who led much of the video evidence review, walked jurors through this footage in painstaking detail during both trials. The footage told a specific story. Cameras in the home were positioned toward the children's bedrooms and the kitchen. Prosecutors argued this placement was intentional, a way for the adults in the household to monitor whether Benjamin was getting up at night to find food. Several videos, recorded in early June of 2021, show him doing exactly that. In the kitchen in the middle of the night, eating fruit, cookies, Jell-O, a fruit cup, and grabbing milk. Over time, based on the footage and the physical evidence from the search, it became progressively harder for him to do this. More locks were added. Access to food narrowed. Some of the most difficult footage came from the days immediately preceding Benjamin's death. In early June, cell phone video captured him in the kitchen at night, asking his father directly, "Dad, can I have bread?" Other clips, recorded closer to August 17th, showed him crying and shaking in the back seat of a car, saying, "I want bread." Casares can be heard in that footage telling him to sit back before the recording cuts off. That particular video was recorded the same morning Benjamin was taken to the hospital. Text messages recovered from Brandon Cervera's phone added another layer to the investigator's case. In exchanges with his ex-wife, Erica Flores, dated to August 2021, Brandon told her to simply give Benjamin bread, writing that, "He don't need to eat dinner." Based on the accumulated evidence, the autopsy findings, the search of the apartment, the video footage, and the text messages, San Antonio police built a case against both adults in the household. In February of 2022, roughly 6 months after Benjamin's death, arrest warrants were issued for Brandon Lee Cervera Sr. and Miranda Casares. Both were charged with injury to a child with intent to cause serious bodily injury. Both were released on bond. it would be more than 2 years before either of them stood trial. Miranda Casares was the first to face a jury. Her trial began in April of 2024 in Casares County's 186th District Court, with Judge Cristina Escalona presiding. Assistant District Attorney Michael Villarreal led the prosecution. In his opening statement, Villarreal told jurors the case was about, in his words, the cold, painful, slow starvation of Benjamin Cervera. Casares' defense attorney, Anthony Cantrell, argued that the reality inside that household was more complicated than the state's narrative, that the family had, at points, sought medical help for Benjamin, and that responsibility for what happened to him did not rest solely, or even primarily, with his stepmother. Jurors in Casares' trial saw the same body of evidence investigators had assembled: the video of Benjamin begging for bread, the images of his emaciated body, the locks discovered in the apartment. They also saw footage that Casares herself had recorded in the days before Benjamin's death, video showing him crying, shaking, and pleading for food and water. On the stand, Casares said she had recorded those videos to convince Brandon to intervene and help the boy. When she testified, Casares denied any responsibility for Benjamin's death. She described herself as a good mother who had loved him. She placed blame instead on Benjamin Cervera, telling jurors he had physically abused the boy. Under cross-examination, prosecutors confronted her with text messages exchanged with her own mother. When pressed on one particular message, Casares initially denied sending it. When Villarreal pointed to a follow-up text sent 3 minutes later, one she acknowledged sending, she grew evasive about the first message, eventually saying only that Brandon would tell me what to say, implying she had been instructed on what to tell investigators. It was a moment prosecutors used to challenge the credibility of her broader defense. The jury did not take long. After about an hour of deliberation, they found Miranda Casares guilty of injury to a child causing serious bodily injury. During the punishment phase that followed, the state asked for the maximum sentence, life in prison. The defense asked for probation. Casares took the stand again, this time in an effort to persuade the jury toward leniency, again denying that she had starved Benjamin and again pointing to Brandon as the person responsible. The jury deliberated for roughly 3.5 to 4 hours before returning its decision: 25 years in prison. Following the sentencing, Casares County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez released a statement calling the case a grim picture of neglect and abuse, and describing death by starvation as horrible and unconscionable. Erica Flores, Benjamin's biological mother, addressed the court directly in a victim impact statement, telling Casares she hoped she would never experience the same emptiness and despair she had left behind. Casares' attorney indicated at the time that they intended to appeal the conviction. That appeal was later denied, and as of the most recent reporting on the case, Casares remains in custody serving her 25-year sentence. With Casares' case resolved, attention turned to Benjamin Cervera Sr. His trial began in late September of 2024, more than 3 years after his son's death, in the same Casares County courtroom, before the same judge. He faced the identical charge Casares had been convicted of: injury to a child causing serious bodily injury. Depending on the outcome, he faced a sentence ranging up to life in prison. The prosecution's case against Brandon largely mirrored the one that had already convicted his ex-wife. Jurors again saw the body cam footage from the July 2021 welfare check, in which Officer Perez described Benjamin as having visible bruising on his eyes and torso, and being thin enough that his bones were visible. They again saw the autopsy evidence, and the medical examiner's finding that Benjamin's death was caused by starvation. Prosecutors again pointed to the locks found throughout the apartment and the text messages in which Brandon had instructed Erica Flores to withhold dinner from his son. Benjamin Cervera's defense, led by attorney Jody Sawyers, took a different approach than Casares' had. Sawyers presented Brandon as an involved, concerned father who had sought medical guidance for Benjamin and followed the recommendations doctors gave him. She argued that the case against her client rested on assumptions rather than proof, that photographs of cabinet locks had been used by prosecutors to fuel what she characterized as a false narrative, without establishing that Brandon himself was responsible for withholding food. She also emphasized a broader statistical point, that death from starvation is extraordinarily rare in the United States, and argued the state had not adequately explained how that rare outcome had occurred on her client's watch without his direct culpability. The defense called its own medical experts, and this is where the two trials diverged most sharply. Both experts who testified for Brandon's defense stated they did not believe Benjamin had died of starvation at all. One of those witnesses acknowledged under cross-examination that he charged approximately $600 an hour for his work on the case, and had been paid roughly $18,000 for about 30 hours of review at that point, not including his time on the stand. Another defense witness, Dr. Daniel Gebhard, a pediatric critical care physician with UT Health San Antonio, testified that while Benjamin had experienced some dehydration and weight loss, in his assessment, neither condition was fatal on its own. The defense also worked to shift responsibility toward Casares specifically. Attorney Sawyers pointed to the same text messages the state had introduced, framing them differently, arguing that Brandon's messages reflected frustration with how Casares was managing food in the household, not an instruction to starve his son. She argued that the message about not giving Benjamin dinner had been taken out of context, telling jurors the boy had already eaten a full loaf of bread that day and that the family was trying to manage his diet, not deprive him of it. The trial lasted roughly a week. Jurors deliberated for about 7 hours. On October 2, 2024, they returned a verdict, not guilty. Brandon Cervera wept when the verdict was read. In a television interview afterward, he described the day of Benjamin's death, the phone call at 10:45 in the morning, the drive to the hospital, and being told doctors had stopped working on his son by 11:32. He said his relationship with Casares had already been deteriorating in the months before Benjamin died, and that he had been considering leaving her. He maintained that he never believed she would hurt his son.
I mean, my life has been torn because of this. To be labeled a monster when evidence hasn't came in, and I want justice for my son, and now I just want to be at peace. I just want to be with my kids.
His attorney, reflecting on the case afterward, described what had happened as, in her words, a battle of wills between Casares and a child with special needs, and said there were aspects of what happened to Benjamin that would likely never be fully known.
Detective that was assigned to this case spent all of an hour interviewing witnesses, and then never went back and questioned any other witnesses after the day Benji passed. He did not look at video recordings of Benji talking in his own words and explaining how he was self-harming himself. Now my client finally gets to mourn his son, because he has not had the opportunity to fully mourn his son, because instead of the focus being on Benji, it was on prosecuting.
The verdict left the case in an unusual place. One adult in the household, Miranda Casares, is serving a 25-year prison sentence for the same underlying charge, based largely on the same body of evidence. The other adult in that household, Benjamin Cervera Sr., was acquitted of that charge by a jury that heard much of that same evidence, alongside a competing medical narrative his defense introduced. Both outcomes came from separate juries, each evaluating the same set of facts through a different lens, reaching different conclusions about where legal responsibility belonged. What remains consistent across both trials, and undisputed by either side, is the medical examiner's ruling. Benjamin Cervera, 4 years old, died of starvation on August 17, 2021. What also remains undisputed is that a police officer stood in that apartment a month earlier, saw a child with black eyes and visible bones, and left the matter to a child welfare system that placed the family on a non-binding safety plan rather than removing Benjamin from the home. Officer Perez's own testimony, that he wished he had done more, stands as one of the few points in this case where an institution, rather than an individual family member, acknowledged failure. As of the most recent reporting, Benjamin Cervera Sr. is a free man, raising his surviving children and speaking publicly about the case. Miranda Casares remains incarcerated, her appeal denied, still maintaining, according to her own testimony, that she bears no responsibility for what happened to her stepson. The legal question of who was criminally responsible for Benjamin Cervera's death has been answered by two separate juries, in two separate ways. The medical question of how he died has never been in dispute. What the case leaves behind is not a clean resolution, but a documented sequence of missed warnings, a welfare check that ended in a referral rather than removal, a safety plan that carried no legal force, and a 4-year-old boy who was recorded on more than one occasion, asking simply for bread. Benjamin Cervera's case is closed in the sense that both trials have concluded. It remains open in every sense that matters to the question of how a child in visible distress, seen directly by law enforcement, was still in that same home 5 weeks later when he died. Two juries looked at the same evidence and reached two different verdicts. That's not a contradiction the documentary needs to resolve. It's the reality of the record. What both trials agreed on, without argument, is simpler and harder to sit with. A 4-year-old boy weighed 28 pounds when he died, and a month before his death, a police officer stood in his kitchen and saw enough to be concerned, and still walked out the door. Officer Perez's testimony is the one moment in this entire case where someone in a position of authority said, plainly, "I could have done more." Not a defense attorney building reasonable doubt. Not a parent explaining away a bruise. Just a person acknowledging a decision that, in hindsight, didn't hold. Miranda Casares is serving 25 years for it. Brandon Cervera is free. Benjamin Cervera is buried. And the videos of him standing in that kitchen asking for bread still exist, because they were entered into evidence, because a jury needed to see them to decide what happened. Cases like this don't usually end with an answer as clean as the crime itself was ugly. They end with a paper trail, a safety plan that wasn't binding, a lock on a bedroom door, a search warrant, two verdicts that don't quite line up. What they leave the rest of us with isn't closure. It's a question that outlives the courtroom. What does the system actually see? And what does it take for someone to act on it before it's too late? That's the story of Benjamin Cervera. Not a mystery. A record of exactly how much was known, and exactly how little was done with it, in time.